Hi, this is a recording to accompany the slides for the lecture on the anatomy of the nervous system, and it's a second out of two lectures. My name is Dr. Alita Partisodarso, and I'll be walking you through these slides. So, first thing I'm going to do is just give you a brief overview of what we're going to cover today. So as you can see here, we're going to cover two main areas, and that is the central nervous system and the peripheral nervous system. The central nervous system is made of the brain and the spinal cord, so we're going to do a brief overview of each of those. The peripheral nervous system consists of ganglion and nerves. In the peripheral nervous system, you can also split it up into spinal nerves, nerves that emerge from the spinal cord, and we're going to talk about the organization of those nerves, and then we're going to finish off by looking at cranial nerves in the peripheral nervous system, and cranial nerves are nerves that emerge from the cranium or the brain. And so we're going to talk about the organization and the function of each of them. So, when we look at the overall function of the central nervous system, we see here that it is the ultimate regulator of the body. It is essential to survival, and what it does is that it's able to actually integrate bits of information from all over the body. So, our brain receives a lot of input from different parts of our body, and what happens is our brain and our spinal cord makes sense of it, integrates it, analyzes it, processes it, and then it makes decisions and sends those decisions out. We know that the central nervous system develops and degenerates over the lifespan of a healthy individual, and this starts in utero, right, in the mother's womb, where the development of the brain and the spinal cord begins. And as a newborn, the central nervous system is not developed yet fully, and you can actually see that in the pictures on the right. So this is the same baby. So the baby was born, I think, 5 weeks premature. This is the same baby. This is the same toque, a year apart, and you can see how much his head and therefore his brain inside that skull of his has grown. So that's just in a year. So as I said, as a newborn, the CNS is not fully developed, and therefore babies really can't do much more than poop and squawk and eat. And then as they actually grow up to be a baby, and then a toddler, and then a young child, and then a teenager, and all that kind of stuff, then they develop more and more complex functions. And so by adulthood, those complex functions would have been fully developed, and then it continues on in that rate until late adulthood when the tissues start degenerating. And so with the brain and spinal cord tissue starting to degenerate, sometimes it ends up with a person having a temporary memory lapse or difficulty with complex motor task. And then if the brain degenerates even further, then the person is then no longer able to do those complex tasks. Speaking of the brain, this is what the brain looks like. So you can see it's a cadaver brain on the top, and then a diagram down the bottom. So what you can see is that the brain is one of the largest organs in the body, clocks in at 1.4 kilos. There are 100 billion neurons and as many neuroglia. And remember, the neuroglia are the support cells, and they include in the CNS, they include ependymal cells, oligodendrocytes, astrocytes, and microglia. Most neurons are produced before or shortly after birth. Remember the baby's head growing in the first year of life. And synapses, connections between different neurons, are made and broken throughout life. In terms of the main divisions of the brain, there are 4 main divisions. So starting down the bottom, you've got the brainstem, which consists of 3 main parts: the medulla oblongata, the pons, and the midbrain. And then you get to the diencephalon, which is the one in the pink, and the diamond shape too. And that consists of the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the pineal gland. And then you've got the cerebellum, which is at the base of the brain. and that's the second largest part of the brain. And then up top, you've got the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. The cerebellum and the cerebrum, so this part here and that part there are divided into left and right hemispheres, or left and right halves. And so we're actually going to look at how that division is made. So when we look at the general parts of the brain, what we can see here is it's split into gray matter and white matter. The thing that gives white matter its color is myelin. Remember, myelin is a type of phospholipid, and lipid, fat, white. So that's so you've got the myelin around the axons that have its cell body in the gray matter. So if you look at the gray matter contains cell body, synapses, and neuroglia of the CNS. So you've got the cell body over here, and then you've got the axon making its way in through the white matter, and it's got myelin on it. So you've got these jelly rolls of myelin, and those jelly rolls of myelin gives the white matter its whiter appearance. If you look over here, you can see that the gray matter in the brain, in the cerebrum and the cerebellum, is the external part. So it's the cortical part. And so that's why it's called the cerebral cortex, because it's on the outside. And these are where connections are made, right? Synapses are connections. So when you have one neuron making a connection with another one, the space in between the two neurons is called the synapse. And the purpose of the gray matter is that it integrates, it receives information, it integrates it, it processes it, and then it sends a signal back down to whatever changes needs to happen. The white matter, you can see here, is located on the inside of the brain, so it's located deeper into the brain, and it contains bundles of axons or tracks, which are usually myelinated, again, to give its white appearance and serve a similar function or travel to or from the same location. So what you can see here in the white matter, it's like the 401. You know how in the 401 you've got lots and lots of different lanes, right? And so what happens is that the white matter consists of these lanes or tracks, which are bundles of axons, and the axons are going in the same direction, and they serve a similar purpose. So you've got a bundle of axons, which actually are called ascending tracks, sorry, are bundles of axons. And when we talk about ascending, it's ascending from the periphery, right? So what happens is the signal comes from the periphery and gets sent up to the brain. And so these ascending tracks are actually sensory tracks, because they bring information from the periphery all the way up to the central nervous system. The other type of tracks are descending tracks. Descending tracks send information down to other parts of the body. And so descending tracks send information down, as I said, and the information that it sends down tells a part of the body to do something. So they are also motor tracks, because they tell the part of the body to have an action, to have a motor effect. And so they're descending or motor tracks. And so these white matter are like the 401 when there's no traffic jam, right? Fast conduction, because it's myelinated fibers, myelinated axons, and they usually follow the same lane. So all the ascending tracks would follow similar lanes, and all the descending tracks would actually go down in other lanes. So we'll look at that in a little bit. The first part of the brain, the largest part of the brain, is the cerebrum. As I said, the outside of the cerebrum is made out of gray matter. The outside is also called the cortex. And so this wrinkled gray matter, as I said, contains the cell bodies, contains connection from sensory neurons. You can see sensory neuron over here, cell body somewhere in the periphery, sending its signal up there, synapsing with an interneuron in the cerebral cortex, and then sending information back down via the motor or descending tract. As it says over here, the cerebrum is also divided into right and left hemispheres, and you can see it over here where you have what's called the falx cerebri. So you can see how there's a deep division over here where there's no continuity of brain matter, and so it splits up the cerebrum into the left half and the right half. And remember, it's the left and right of the person's brain that's facing you in the anatomical position. Overall function of the cerebrum listed over here: complex integrative functions of sensory perception, complex voluntary muscle movement, conscious thought, memory, language, problem solving. So it's a whole lot of activities that is part and parcel of the function of the cerebrum. As I said, the outside part of the cerebrum is called the cerebral cortex, and it's made out of gray matter. The inside part is the white matter, right? And it's made out of tracts, right? So tracts are bundles of axons traveling the same location or serving a similar function. And then I talked about how it's divided into two, the right and left hemispheres. And the thing that divides it into two is called the falx cerebri, or the longitudinal fissure, right? So this longitudinal fissure goes in deep, separates the right and the left. And then the way that the right hemisphere communicates with the left hemisphere and vice versa is with the help of white matter that spans from one side of the cerebrum to the same location on the other side of the cerebrum. So you've got this corpus callosum that basically spans and connects both sides, the two halves of the cerebrum. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. When we look at the outside features of the cerebral cortex, again, you've got that longitudinal fissure which splits the right and the left hemisphere. So you've got the left hemisphere here, the right hemisphere here, and it looks very wrinkled on the outside. And the fissure runs all the way from front to back of the cerebrum. We've also got different indentations. So as you look at the brain, you've got these ridges and valleys, right? You've got this wrinkled appearance. And so where it bumps up, where it forms a ridge, is called a gyrus. Gyri for plural. Where it goes down or makes a valley, it's called the sulcus, or if it's deep enough, it's called a fissure. So the longitudinal fissure is called a fissure rather than the longitudinal sulcus because it reaches quite deep. If you look at the diagram on the right, you can see that there are other sulcus and sulci and gyri. And so you've got the central sulcus, which divides the frontal lobe to the parietal lobe. And again, just note the names of the lobes. The lobes are named after the bone that it lies underneath. So the frontal lobe, it lies underneath the frontal bone, parietal lobe underneath the parietal bone, occipital lobe underneath the occipital bone, temporal lobe underneath the temporal bone. So again, you don't need to memorize this if you know exactly where the bones of the skull is. So you've got sulcus dividing each of these lobes, right? You've got the central sulcus separating out the frontal lobe from the parietal lobe. You've got the parieto-occipital sulcus separating out, funnily enough, the parietal lobe from the occipital lobe. And you've got the lateral sulcus separating out the parietal lobe from the temporal lobe. All right. And then the two important gyruses or gyri that I want to bring your attention to is the pre-central gyrus and the post-central gyrus. And again, if you know where the central valley, well, the central sulcus is, the one the bump, the valley, sorry, the ridge immediately in front of the central sulcus is called the pre-central gyrus. The ridge that is immediately behind the central sulcus is called the post-central gyrus. So the post-central gyrus is part of the parietal lobe. The pre-central gyrus is part of the frontal lobe. And again, we'll talk more about that as we go along. So you've got here the lobes of the cerebrum and what it does. As I said, this pre-central and post-central gyrus. So the motor cortex is the pre-central gyrus, and the somatosensory cortex is the post-central gyrus over here. And these are responsible for processing different things. So the somatosensory cortex, right, of the parietal lobe is responsible for receiving input from different parts of your body. So if you look at the picture down below over here, right, you can see that it receives information from different parts of the body over here. This is called the sensory homunculus, and basically what it is, it's a visual representation of how much sensation each of these body parts receive, or how sensitive it is. So the bigger the body part, the more sensitive it is to receiving sensory information. So you can see over here, you've got the fingers are fairly sensitive, the lips are very sensitive here, the teeth also very sensitive, and so on and so forth. The red one over here is the motor cortex, and so this is called the motor homunculus. And what it does is it actually sends information to all these different parts of the body. So you can see over here, the wrist is large. You've got big thumb, big fingers, big mouth, right? Big tongue. And so again, the size of the body part means that it's relative to how much information gets sent to it. And if you look at these two guys over here, again, they're just switched in terms of color. So the motor model is the information that's sent to different parts of the body to make them move. The sensory model is the information that's sent to the brain from these body parts and how sensitive it is. So if you look over here, the arms, your upper arm, elbow, lower arm is very skinny compared to your hand, because your hands are very sensitive parts of the body, and they receive a lot of information for us to actually live a normal life. You've got over here just the other different functions of the different lobes that you can read as well as I can. When we get to the inner part of the cerebral cortex, we've got nuclei. And remember, nuclei is a collection of cell bodies in the central nervous system. And when you have a lot of cell bodies all together, you also have synapses there, right? And what these are, they are called subcortical nuclei because they're a collection of cell bodies just underneath the cerebral cortex, right? And so you've got these three different collections over here. You've got the basal nuclei and the ganglia, which regulate motivation and also regulate voluntary motor control related to walking, posture, and other repetitive movements. In Parkinson's disease, it's the basal ganglia that is affected. You've also got the corpus callosum. So the corpus callosum are bands of white matter which communicate between the left and right hemispheres of the cerebrum. And then you've got the limbic system. So the limbic system is involved in regulating emotional responses, including fear, and the limbic system is also involved in the formation of long-term memory. Moving along to the diencephalon. Diencephalon has three main parts: the thalamus, the hypothalamus, and the pineal gland. So the purpose of the thalamus is that it's a processing center for sensory information before the sensory information is being sent to the cerebral cortex. So if you draw, say, a person over here, you know it's a person and not a neuron because it's got hands. And say this person steps on a rock over here. What happens is then that sensory information is sent up through the spinal cord into the central nervous system, where it the first neuron may end in the thalamus. And then what happens is the thalamus receives other input from other places. So it processes it right over there, and then it sends another neuron. It sends the information via another neuron to the cerebrum, right? So so it also does that. So it's a processing center for sensory information before being sent to the cerebral cortex, and it also receives information from the cerebrum on its way down to the periphery, and on the way down to the cerebellum and the brainstem. The hypothalamus is the next major part of the diencephalon, and what you can see here is that the hypothalamus does a heck of a lot. So it's involved in regulating homeostasis, so water balance, temperature, and appetite. In fact, the thirst center of the body is located in the hypothalamus. It's got osmoreceptors to monitor how thick your blood is. It also is the link between the nervous system, which is a very quick responder, and the endocrine system, which is a slower response system. Hypothalamus is involved also in memory and emotion, and it's the major relay station between the cerebral cortex above it and the autonomic centers. So it is also involved in processing autonomic systems. It's also crucial for arousal mechanism, helps us stay awake, and all that kind of stuff. Third part is the pineal gland. And so the pineal gland, this is a picture of the pineal gland and what it does. The pineal gland is an endocrine gland, produces the hormone melatonin, and you can see here melatonin is released into the blood. And what melatonin does is it regulates our sleep-wake cycle. So if you look at the diagram right here at the top, you can see that the levels of melatonin are low during the day, like from 2 o'clock to about 7 or 8. And then as the night progresses, levels of melatonin go way up, and then it starts coming down in the wee hours of the morning until it reaches its low level at about 11 o'clock. So that's when 11 a.m. is when we're supposed to be nice and awake, and it stays low until that cycle repeats. So melatonin is usually can is usually called the sleep hormone or the timekeeping hormone. In animals, it also regulates fertility cycles. Um, in people, it regulates what we call the biological clock from day to day, or the circadian rhythm. Next part of the brain is the brainstem. So it's down the bottom, and you can see over here it's composed of white matter projection tracts and the reticular formation, which is a network of gray and white matter. As it states over here, the brainstem is divided into three different parts: the midbrain, which is the most superior, the pons in the middle, and then the medulla is the most inferior, or the lowest part of the brain. The medulla is the one that is involved in autonomic reflexes. So we're going to cover autonomic reflexes when we're going to talk about the cardiovascular system, when we're going to talk about the respiratory system, when we're going to talk about the digestive system. Right? So the medulla oblongata is involved in those reflexes. The pons, which is above the medulla, below the midbrain, is involved in some cranial nerve reflexes and in pneumotaxic centers. And pneumotaxic centers help regulate respiration, so breathing. And the midbrain, which is the most superior part, or the topmost part of the brainstem, is involved again in some cranial reflexes and communication between the auditory, the hearing, and the visual, the seeing centers. Next part of the brain is the cerebellum, sometimes called the little brain. It's the second largest part of the brain, next to the cerebrum, which is the largest part of the brain. And what you can see here is that the anatomy or the structure of the cerebellum is very similar to the cerebrum. It's got wrinkled outsides with sulci, gyri. It's divided into left and right hemispheres. It's got an outer cortex made out of gray matter and an inner part which is made out of white matter, and it looks like a tree. So someone decided to call it the arbor vitae, the tree of life. And then it's also got these peduncles, which contains tracts, so myelinated axons, which communicate between different parts of the cerebellum, as well as between the cerebellum and other parts of the central nervous system. Role of the cerebellum, when you look over here, is that it works together with the cerebral cortex to produce skilled movements by coordinating activities of groups of muscles. Cerebellum acts at an unconscious level to smooth movements, to maintain balance and posture. It also receives information from muscular proprioceptors. So proprioceptors are these sensory receptors in different parts of our muscle that tell us our relative location or position of different muscles in our body. And so imagine if you're teaching someone to actually shoot hoops on a basketball court, that involves the cerebellum, because the cerebellum receives information from the various body parts as you're actually running, doing a layup, shooting hoops, what have you. It receives that information, processes it, and makes the movement of shooting hoops a smooth movement, right? So you can see here, processes sensory information, compares motor commands, sends signals down in order and smooth it over so that we appear skilled when we're doing something that we've done repetitive practice at. That was the brain. Now we come to the spinal cord. So the spinal cord has got we've got the spinal cord and spinal nerves. So the spinal nerve are parts of the spinal cord that emerge from different parts of the spinal cord, right? So as the nerves emerge from the spinal cord proper, it becomes the spinal nerve. So you remember the intervertebral foramina? So foramina means it's a small foramen, a small hole. So you see this notch over here. This notch is a space that allows a spinal nerve to emerge from the spinal cord without actually pinching it. And each vertebrae has this indentation to allow spinal nerves to do that. When you look over here, you see that the spinal cord stops lengthening at the age of 4 to 5 years old. And so the end of the spinal cord proper ends in a cone shape called the conus medullaris. And then below the cone, what you see is you have these wisps of spinal nerves that, to some anatomists who looked down the microscope to observe this or looked at a cadaver, thought that it looked like a horse's tail. So they called it the horse's tail, the cauda equine, right? The horse's tail over here. So that's what the spinal cord looks like on the outside. When we look at the inside the spinal cord and where it attaches, you remember the pia mater? The pia mater is the innermost meninges, right? That covers the spinal cord and the brain. And what happened is that the pia mater has extensions which help to anchor the spinal cord. Because if these pia mater extensions don't exist, then the spinal cord is going to bounce every time you take a step. It's going to bounce severely every time you run, hop, skip, what have you, right? Jog. And so what happens is then you've got these extensions which help to anchor the spinal cord within the foramen of the vertebra, of the vertebrae. And so there's two types of extensions. The first one is the denticulate ligament. So you can see the gray bits. They basically anchor the spinal nerves sideways. So they emerge and anchor the spinal cord so it can't move side to side, right? And it helps to stop the up and down bounce of the spinal cord. And then the other thing that anchors the spinal cord within the vertebral foramen is the filum terminale. And the filum terminale is an extension of the pia mater, which starts at the end of the conus medullaris and goes all the way down to anchor the spinal cord to the coccyx, to the tailbone. And so you've got this, and then you've got the denticulate ligament, and those two extensions of the pia mater help to stop the spinal cord from bouncing around side to side, up and down, as we actually go around our business. The two other features of the spinal cord are enlargements that occur at the neck region, called the cervical enlargement, and another one that occurs at the lower thoracic region, but it's called the lumbar enlargement. And what these are cell bodies. These enlargement contain cell body that project to the limbs. So the cervical enlargement contains cell bodies of neurons that project to the arms and the hands, and the lumbar enlargement contains cell bodies of neurons that project to the feet and the legs, right? So they have to be housed somewhere, they have to be housed together, so they're housed in these enlargements within the spinal cord. When we look at a slice of the spinal cord, so, this is the spinal cord over here. This is a section, right? So we're just taking a section over here, and we're actually looking at it face down on a microscope. what we can see is when we just put it flat, what we can see is we can see two sulcus, or a sulcus and a fissure. Remember, a fissure is deeper and a sulcus is not as deep, right? So the only relevance of this to you is if you're a MedLab student and you're looking at slices of spinal cord, the part that has a deeper indentation is the anterior median fissure, and the part that has a shallower indentation is called the posterior median sulcus. And the only relevance of this is you can orient yourself as to what's the front, anterior, and what's the back of the spinal cord. You see over here, you've got a little hole over here called the central canal, and this is where cerebrospinal fluid runs through. I've talked about the anterior median fissure, and then the other thing you can see is that you've got these horns, right? You've got these gray matter horns of the spinal cord. So you've got the horns at the back, so these projections of gray matter at the back, which are called the posterior or dorsal horn, and they contain cell bodies of sensory neurons. And the ones in the front, called the anterior ventral horns, contain cell bodies of motor neurons. And the ones at the side, the lateral horns, contain cell bodies of the autonomic neurons of the sympathetic division, right? So what you can see is that the spinal cord is organized, right? So basically, if you're a sensory neuron, cell bodies over here, motor neuron, cell bodies over here, autonomic neuron, cell bodies over here, right? So everything is kind of grouped together. When we look at the white matter, which if you look at this and you compare it to the brain, you can see that it's opposite, right? In the spinal cord, the white matter is on the outside and the gray matter is on the inside. In the brain, the gray matter is on the outside and the white matter is on the inside. But I digress. So when we look at the white matter, what we can see is that, again, this is a slice, but if you look at the spinal cord over here, what you can see is there are myelinated axons, right? There are bunches of myelinated axons called tracts or column, and the axons within each tract or column travel to and from the same direction. So ascending tracts that send information up to the brain, carry sensory information, whereas descending tracts, axons that carry information from the brain to the periphery, carry motor commands that tell the body to do stuff in response to whatever actually goes up in the brain. Posterior column, you can see here, contains ascending tracts, right? So the posterior columns here contain ascending tracts, and that makes sense because the cell bodies of sensory neurons are over here. Columns in the front, in the anterior columns, contain both ascending and descending tracts. So again, makes sense because the cell bodies of motor neurons are found in the anterior or ventral horns. And then lateral columns on the side contains both ascending and descending tracts. So that's it for the central nervous system. One other thing I wanted to say is when you look at tracts and the names of the tracts, most tracts have got a double-barreled name. So it would be, say, the corticospinal tract. And what happens if you split the name in half, this is where it comes from. So it comes from the cerebral cortex, goes to the spinal cord. So this is the name of a descending descending tract, right? Because that's where it comes from. This is where it goes to. If you have another tract called the spinothalamic tract, again, it goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus. This would be an ascending tract, right? Because it goes from the spinal cord to the thalamus over here. So if you have come across the name of a tract and it's got a double-barreled name, the first half is where it comes from, the second half is where it goes to, and then from there you can figure out whether it's an ascending tract or a descending tract. When we go to the peripheral nervous system, we also have cell bodies. We also have axons in the peripheral nervous system. But while groups of cell bodies in the central nervous system are called nuclei, in the peripheral nervous system, a bunch of neuron cell bodies are called ganglia. Again, when you have a bunch of axons in the central nervous system, they're called tracts or column. In the peripheral nervous system, they're called fibers or axons, right? And in the peripheral nervous system, these axons can either be myelinated, fast conduction, or unmyelinated, slower conduction. The first part of the peripheral nervous system are the spinal nerves. So basically the spinal nerves are named for the level of spinal cord that each one emerges from. So there are 8 cervical nerves that emerge from the 8 cervical vertebrae. There are 12 thoracic spinal nerves that emerge from the thoracic vertebrae. There are 5 lumbar nerves that emerge from the lumbar vertebrae, and then the sacral nerves, and then the coccygeal nerves, right? So you can see that they're paired, left and right, and they emerge at, they're named after the level that it emerges from. Now, when they leave the spinal cord, they don't just do this, right? What happens is they form these plexuses or networks of nerve fibers. And we can see this in this next slide. So what you can see here is that these axons form these networks, and you can see that there are 4 different networks. And if you look at the nerves that form these different networks or plexus, you can see that they're grouped together, right? The cervical plexus is formed from spinal nerves from C1 to C5. And what happens is it comes at the neck over here. And so it innervates the muscles and skin of the neck, upper shoulders, part of the head, and the diaphragm. Brachial plexus is right over here. So it contains the parts of the nerves from the C5 vertebrae, C5 spinal nerve to the T1, and it innervates the lower shoulder and the entire arm. So you can see just by its location what it sort of innervates. The lumbar plexus is down below, innervates the thigh and leg via the femoral nerve, and then the sacral plexus is beneath the lumbar plexus, and again it innervates other parts of the leg over here. Now, an interesting part is that there's no plexus in the thoracic region. And that's because the thoracic region is just your thoracic cage, right? So there's no complexity in those nerves over there, so they don't form a plexus there. Now, when the nerves emerge from the spinal cord, they eventually form what we know as the spinal nerve. So if you look over here, the spinal nerve contains 2 different axons. They contain motor axons as well as sensory axons. If you look over here, in order to form a spinal nerve, you've got a thing that comes out of the spinal cord at the back end, and that thing that emerges from the spinal cord at the back part is called the dorsal root, and the similar bit that emerges from the front part of the spinal cord is called the ventral root, right? So the ventral root contains axons of motor neurons. So the ventral root sends information to the periphery, whereas the dorsal root receives information from the periphery over here. So the ventral and the dorsal root then combine to form the spinal nerve. So the spinal nerve goes both ways, right? Gets information from the periphery, sends information to the periphery. And that's what forms the spinal nerve. After it forms the spinal nerve, you can see it over here, it splits up again. And when it splits up after it forms the spinal nerve, it forms ramus or rami, right? So it forms a dorsal ramus and a ventral ramus. And over here, what it happens is it splits up and it sends and receives information from different parts of the body. So the dorsal ramus sends and receives information from the back half of the body, and the ventral ramus sends and receives information from the parts of the body in front of the spinal nerve, in front of the spinal cord. So basically, the ventral ramus is responsible for a lot more of the body parts because we have a lot more of the body in front of the spinal cord. So if you look over here, ventral ramus innervates the muscle and glands, lateral and ventral, so side and front portions of the neck and trunk may contain autonomic fibers and can form those plexuses, those networks. The dorsal ramus innervates the muscle and skin of the back surface of the head, neck, and trunk, right? Because we have just the back of our back and the back of our head, neck, and trunk behind the spinal cord. When we look at the flow of information of spinal nerves, and again, go through this slide several times, what we have is when we start at the sensory neurons, so from the peripheral, what happens is they have their cell bodies in this ganglion called the dorsal root ganglion. So if you look at the name, the ganglion is a collection of cell bodies. It's located in the dorsal root, and the dorsal root is and contains axons, which sends information to the spinal cord. And so it enters into the spinal cord over here, right? Synapses in the dorsal horn, which is right over here. And then processing happens in the spinal cord. And then information gets sent to the ventral horn, which is the bit of gray matter at the front end of the spinal cord. And then that information is then processed and then packaged and then sent through the motor nerve, which then sends the information down in the periphery, exits the spinal cord via the ventral root. And then what happens is the ventral root then becomes part of the spinal nerve over here, and then goes and does whatever the motor neuron is supposed to do. So as it says over here, you've got the dorsal root and the ventral root combining to form the spinal nerve. And then after it gets into the spinal nerve, then it splits up again into the dorsal ramus and the ventral ramus. And as I said before, the ventral ramus innervates or provides nerve supply to everything in front of the spinal cord. The dorsal ramus provides innervation to everything behind the spinal cord. When we get into the ramus, So as I said, the spinal cord splits up into the dorsal and ventral rami. So you can see over here the dorsal rami or ramuses innervates everything behind the spinal cord, which includes muscles and skin of the dorsal surface of the head, neck, and trunk. And then the ventral ramus innervates everything in front of the spinal cord, which includes muscles, glands, lateral and ventral, so side and front portions of the neck and trunk. And we also have some autonomic fibers emerging from the ventral ramus. And the ventral ramus can also form those networks or plexus. The simplest way I can explain it is that if you look at the 401, the 401 is the spinal cord, right? Very fast, assuming there's no traffic jam or congestion. It goes both ways. And then what happens is you've got on and off ramps, right? So the on and off ramps are, so on and off ramps are your roots, right? Because you either go off or you come on the 401. So those are the roots. And then usually what happens is that it forms a short two-way road. In this case, it's Bloor. And then what happens is then Bloor then splits up into a north or south. So the north or south, I would call it as being the ramus, right? So the south would be the dorsal ramus, because there's not much south of the 401, because you've got Lake Simcoe, right? And then north of the 401, you've got the rest of Stevenson Road that goes all the way up to goodness knows where. So again, that's how I picture it when I think about roots and rami and spinal nerves and what have you. Next bit is the cranial nerves. So similar to the spinal nerves emerging from the spinal cord, the cranial nerves emerge from the brain. We've got 12 pairs of cranial nerves. As you can see here, they're numbered from front to back, right? From anterior to posterior. So first one is the olfactory nerve, which is the most anterior. Last one is the 12th nerve, which is the most posterior. These nerves are classified into either sensory-only nerve, motor-only nerve, or mixed nerves. So mixed nerves contain both, which is where the B comes from, sensory and motor neurons. And remember, a nerve is a bunch of axons, right? So axons are these long parts of these nerves. So if you think about the CNS over here, and this is the periphery. So nerves that project down to the periphery are called motor neurons, and neurons that send information to the central nervous system that go that way are called sensory neurons. Right? So some of these nerves, like the olfactory nerve and the optic nerve, are sensory nerves because they send information from the nose, olfactory system, or the eyes to the brain, whereas other cranial nerves like the oculomotor nerve, again, oculo means eyes, motor is motor, are mainly motor nerves. So couple of tips to help you remember the names of the nerves. You've got mnemonics, and you can search up different ones. These are the most PC ones that I could find. So to help you remember the first letter of each word corresponds with the first letter of the name of each of the cranial nerves, right? So on old Olympus' tiny tops, a friendly Viking grew vines and hops. So that helps you remember nerves, cranial nerves 1 to 12. If you want to remember the functional classification of the nerves, remember nerves starting with an S are sensory nerves, nerves starting with an M are motor nerves, nerves starting with a B, indicated by a B, have got both sensory and motor function. So some say merry money, but my brothers say bad business, merry money. So again, you can find lots of other ones on the internet. These are the most PC ones that I could find. So I split up the cranial nerves into 2 slides. And again, a couple of things. Just learn the Roman numerals. It's not really that hard. So, this is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So you've got olfactory nerve, which is cranial nerve 1, is sensory nerve only, receives information about smell. Optic nerve, sensory nerve only, receives information about sight. Third nerve is the oculomotor nerve. Again, motor nerve only, controls external eye movements. Trochlear nerves, motor nerve only, controls a muscle of the eye. Trigeminal nerve, name tri, means that there are 3 nerves mixed up into one. So you can see here, ophthalmic nerve, maxillary nerve, mandibular nerve. And you know what the maxilla and the mandible do. So no surprise that it controls the muscles of mastication. Mastication means chewing. And then the abducens nerve also helps to control muscle movement of the eye. So these are cranial nerves 1 to 6. Cranial nerves 7 to 12 are listed over here. So cranial nerve 7 is a mixed nerve, contains both motor and sensory function. Cranial nerve 7 is called the facial nerve. Again, from its name, controls muscles of the face and scalp. Also receives information from the tongue, so taste buds. Vestibular nerve, cranial nerve number 8 is the vestibulocochlear nerve. So it's got 2 different nerves, both of which are sensory nerves. So vestibular nerve is involved with equilibrium, cochlear nerve is involved with hearing. Ninth nerve is the glossopharyngeal nerve. Again, glosso refers to tongue, right? Pharyngeal refers to throat. So again, it controls the tongue and the pharynx and receives information from those areas as well. The vagus nerve, cranial nerve number 10, my favorite nerve. It's called the vagus because it comes from the same word as vagrant. Because if you look at the vagus nerve over here, it wanders around, right? So it wanders around, innervates the heart, innervates the larynx, trachea, bronchi, esophagus, stomach, and a whole host of visceral organs over here. Nerve number 11 is the accessory nerve. Motor nerve only, controls the trapezius and sternocleidomastoid nerves, muscles, And then the 12th nerve is the hypoglossal nerve, which controls the tongue muscle. I know there's a lot of information on this. I don't apologize for it because the human brain and spinal cord are complex structures, but please take the time to actually go through this maybe a couple of times. Thank you.